Good afternoon, councillors. We'll get underway. As you've seen, we've got a proper doorstep of an agenda pack this time around. Hopefully we won't be going through it line by line. We'll be here a long time. Okay. Okay. Welcome everybody to this meeting, Development Plan Panel. My name is Councillor John Garvani and I'll be chairing today's meeting. The meeting is being live streamed on the City Council YouTube channel so that the public can observe the meeting without needing to be present. Could I now invite members and officers to introduce themselves? If we could start from my left.
Afternoon everyone, I'm Councillor Jess Lennox, I'm the Exec Board Member for Housing.
I'm Councillor Paul Ray and I'm the Chair of the South and West Plans Panel.
Yeah, good afternoon everyone, Councillor Javed Akhtar, Chair for North and East Plans Panel.
Good afternoon everybody, Councillor Jones from Horsforth, substituting for Jules Heselwood today, Councillor Heselwood today.
Good afternoon, Councillor Peter Carlill, Carlin Farsley Ward.
Good afternoon, Councillor Jonathan Pryor, Deputy Leader of the Council.
Good afternoon, Paul Bingham, Team Leader in Strategic Planning.
Good afternoon, Caroline Harris, Principal Planner in Strategic Planning.
Good afternoon, Catherine Holloway, Team Leader in Sites and Policies, Strategic Planning.
Good afternoon, Ian Mackay, Team Leader in Strategic Planning.
Good afternoon everyone, Councillor Alan Lamb, I represent Wetherby Ward and I'm Leader of the Opposition.
I'm Robert Finnegan, I'm a Councillor for the Morley North Ward.
Councillor Barry Anderson, Adland Wharfdale Ward.
Councillor David Blackburn, Farnley and Wortley Ward, substituting for Penny Stables.
Good afternoon everyone, I'm Councillor Colin Campbell.
Good afternoon everyone, I'm Helen Gray, I'm the clerk for the panel this afternoon.
Good afternoon, Philippa Plumtree Varley, Principal Legal Officer and Legal Advisor to panel today.
Good afternoon, I'm Martin Elliott, I'm Head of Strategic Planning.
Thank you. Move to the agenda. Can the clerk run through the first 5 formal items?
Thank you, Chair. Under agenda item number 1, there are no appeals against refusal of inspection of documents. Agenda item number 2, there's no items which require the exclusion of the press or the public. Item number 3, there's no formal late items. However, members are in receipt of a supplementary pack which was also published on the Council's website relating to agenda item 7. Under agenda item number 4, could I ask members to declare any interest that they might have? I can see none, thank you. And under agenda item number 5, just to reiterate, apologies for absence have been received from Councillor Heselwood and Councillor Jones substitutes, and from Councillor Stables and Councillor Blackburn is substituting. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll move on to item number 6, which is pages 7 to 16 of the agenda pack, minutes of the previous meeting held on the 18th of March. Do members accept these minutes as a true and correct record? Don't want to go through them page by page. Everybody happy with all that? Thank you. Okay, any matters arising from those minutes? Nope. Good. Okay, agenda item 7, Leeds Local Plan, a planning framework for development 2024 to 2042. Starts at page 17 of your main pack through to page 622. Right, officers to provide update and presentation.
Thanks, Chair. Okay, thanks, Councillor Gavani. So the report in front of you this afternoon, I'm very pleased to bring it to you. It represents kind of a key step forward in the production of a new local plan for Leeds, which is really important to have, as it provides clarity to developers and residents of the city as to where development's going to go, how it's going to look, how it's going to be shaped, and how much of it there's going to be. And that's important because it helps determine planning applications in accordance with the local plan, and it also helps avoid speculative development from developers. This report sets out highly advanced draft material which will ultimately form the Council's public consultation material. And that public consultation will take place from early July to September, and it will be held for about 10 weeks. And you're being asked this afternoon to note the material, provide comments on it, and recommend to Executive Board that it be published for consultation. Development Plan Panel has guided the preparation of this material over the last 18 months, since the local plan was initially consulted on in early 2023. Since that time, the Council has merged its two development plan documents due to uncertainty around national guidance and a greater coincidence between the timeframes of Leeds Local Plan Update 1 and Leeds Local Plan. That means what we have here today is a wholesale plan update, an update to the current 250 odd policies which are across currently 5 planning documents. So we are updating the Unitary Development Plan, the Air Valley Plan, the Site Allocations Plan, the Core Strategy, and the Natural Resources and Waste Plan. So I know there was a lot of material in front of you here this afternoon, but that's because we're looking at consolidating 5 plans into one. We were doing it through 2 development plan documents, but we're now doing it in one. So this task hasn't been done, and it hasn't been this big since we prepared the Unitary Development Plan back in 2006. I'll say from the off as well that it's worth noting that the format in which you are getting this material this afternoon is not the format that it will be consulted on. Inevitably, we haven't got all the online material ready because that's going to be ready for early July. But you do have to have sight of this material and you have to understand what comprises it. So that's why you have it as static sort of PDFs. The way the public will get this material is in a lot more of a subsidiary fashion, where they will have the option to look at very simply articulated objectives and approaches, and then dig down into more detail if they wish. So consultees are certainly not to be expected to wade through all the material that you've had to consider this afternoon, there is an intent, and we are still working on, whilst the technical content of the material that you are asked to look at this afternoon is fixed, we are still working on the language and working on summaries and making sure the English is plain. So just to run through the content that's in front of you this afternoon, we've got a report, which is quite a long report, but what that does is that really acts as an executive summary of all of the material that forms part of the local plan. That will form its own basis of an executive summary document, and it sets out the proposed vision and the objectives of the local plan, and those objectives are sort of framed as quite specific objectives which make up the vast majority of the report. They're framed around 3 things. The first is around the amount of development, what the need for development is. Secondly, how that's to be distributed and spread across the district. And thirdly, how it will look and what sort of policies there are to help assist in placemaking that development. Appendix 1 is a series of topic papers which support those objectives. They are summary documents which again will be tailored for public consultation, and the aim will be to get all of these in a plain English format before consultation. Then you've got Appendix 1B, which are a suite of sites that are under consideration in the plan, and Appendix 1C that sets out the methodology for how these sites have initially been assessed. And this is an initial assessment. It's the Council's technical view on the merits of these sites and how they contribute towards the objectives. But what we are looking for is we are looking for local people, and we are looking for site promoters to come back to us and say whether or not they agree with the way these sites have been assessed. Appendix 2 contains more detailed supporting papers, which are critical because it's within these papers that quite a lot of the technical compliance material is found, the links to pieces of evidence, detailed justification to support proposed objectives and topics against national guidance. All of these things are very important when we come to an examination of the plan, because these are the things that an inspector will be looking to test the council on, and any objectors to the plan will need to grapple with this evidence and with this justification, this technical detail. So it is fairly dense, but it is necessary. But what it does is it supports a higher level expression of the direction of travel of the council in Appendix 1. Appendix 3 is a report of consultation. We do this at every stage. When we've had a consultation, we set out what we heard, how we've listened to people, and what we've done as a result of that. So that's set out in Appendix 3 as a result of the last consultation that was held. Appendix 4 and 5 are a key legal requirement of the plan, which is to provide a sustainability appraisal. And that document sets out the approach to looking at the sustainability appraisal and the suite of objectives that we'll be assessing policies when they're written in due course against. But it also provides sort of an initial high-level sustainability assessment of the objectives and the direction of travel against alternatives. Appendix 6 will be made available for Executive Board. That's an Equalities Impact Assessment, which is in preparation. Appendix 7 is an initial habitats regulations consideration, which again is a legal requirement for the plan. And Appendix 8 will set out the way in which the Council intends to approach the duty to cooperate. There is some commentary on that within the report itself, but Appendix 8 will set out a little more detail on that. As well as that, there are links to background papers which form the Council's key evidence-based documents, and the key ones there are the Strategic Housing Market Assessment and the Employment Land Assessment. And turning now to the content, Development Plan Panel has been involved, as I said, in shaping this material for some time, but in sum, the proposed plan is one that sets out to deliver the government's local housing need, which has been set for us nationally, sets out to deliver on the government's, the sub-regions and the council's economic growth missions, sets out to prepare for the significant transport investment that will be hopefully delivered in this city through the delivery of mass transit, sets out to deliver significantly more affordable housing to meet needs across the district, shapes where development goes so that it will deliver inclusive growth with a focus on an expanded city centre and key corridors, and supplemented by a need to meet local needs locally, because the SHMA identifies that all areas of Leeds have a housing need, be it for a specialist housing, general housing or affordable housing. It also sets out what that will look like and sets a series of ambitious design and placemaking policies which seek to improve the quality of development that we receive and that will be determined through plans panels, and sets a framework which will help address the net zero ambition to mitigate carbon, firstly by focusing development where it won't generate excess transport emissions, but also seeking to improve energy efficiency, not only of buildings, but also of the resilience of energy supply across the district. And finally, it sets out that will make places more resilient to the impacts of climate change, including flooding, heat, and the impacts upon health and well-being of drier summers, and the importance of the role of things like green infrastructure and green space in terms of contributing to those health and well-being indicators. So I'm pleased to bring this report to your attention. A lot of work has gone into it, including from this panel. And as it makes its way through public consultation, we will be listening to what people have to say and prepared to make to take those comments on board as we write detailed policies in the next stage. So I'm sure you've got questions. I've got officers at the back of the room. Ian Mackay is here to talk about sort of the consultation. I've got Paul Bingham, who's here to talk about sort of the approach to site assessments. and we've got other officers in the room that can help with detailed questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Do either Paul or Ian want to chip in now?
Chair, can I say I think it might be useful if I think it's Paul did talk us just briefly through how you've done the site assessments, not just for ourselves but for whoever's watching on the television.
Yeah, so you've got, sorry, I haven't got the appendix number, but obviously you've got the appendix with the site assessment methodology in there, and the approach. You could just give me a minute to just bring it up. And yeah, I'll just bring up the paper. Thank you. So the approach we've taken. So we've tried to do an objective assessment.
Sorry, I consider myself relatively knowledgeable. I'm absolutely lost as to where appendixes begin. Can you talk about the page number so that we can then go to that respective page number and see exactly what you're talking about? Because I've been through this twice now, and I cannot see anything about how the site assessments have been.
Could you just give me a bit of time to just pick up the paper? Sorry, I wasn't.
So Councillor Anderson, page 599 is the explanation of how the site assessments have been carried out. So in your material, it's page 599.
So it's Appendix 1B in the papers. That's the results of the assessments of each site, and we have Appendix 1C, which is the methodology introduction that supports that.
Can you just hold on a second, please, Paul? There's a bit of confusion as to the members finding it. Has everybody found the appropriate page? Okay. I think you might need to fetch your microphone even closer, Paul. Thanks.
So I'll run through Appendix 1C, which is the explanation of the methodology, and then Appendix 1B has the results of the application of that methodology to all the sites. So the way we've done it is we've looked at all sites that have been submitted to us at the last stage of consultation, which we call the exercise we call the call for sites. So that gave the opportunity for all developers and members of the community to submit sites to us. We've also added sites that we've identified ourselves that are vacant or derelict within urban areas, and that's called the urban capacity study. So we found additional sites there that may have potential for development. And the other source of sites we've got in there are existing planning approvals and allocations that we're reassessing whether they're suitable to bring forward into the future for this future plan period. So there's three sources of supply. Sometimes they overlap, so some of those sites have been submitted as well, so we get them through a couple of sources. And we've looked at the boundaries of those sites and we've assessed them against a series of tests against planning considerations. And it's only based on the boundary, so there's been no other sort of manual assessment or judgment made. It's just comparing boundaries of the sites to various attributes. And we've done that in two stages. So the first stage is we've got a series of gateway tests, and they're like crucial factors that might rule out a site on that would rule out a site on its own. So it's things like functional floodplain, sites of special scientific interest, whether there be significant or substantial harm to a heritage asset, which at this stage we can only flag up where we need to do further assessment because it's obviously a manual decision. there's any impact on ancient woodlands. So they're attributes of a site that would rule it out based on the boundary that's been submitted to us. So that's a gateway test. The other aspect that we've tested there is whether it conforms with the settlement network, but because we're still consulting on that network, we've not reached a decision on that, so we've just flagged up whether it's within an existing settlement, whether it adjoins it, or whether it's outside it. So that's for information for consultees to see, how the site might perform against that at the moment. But clearly, as we're consulting on the settlement hierarchy as part of this, there's no final decision there. It's a bit different to things like functional floodplain, which are already established boundaries. So that's a gateway test, and when we get to the publication draft version of this plan, any sites that failed the gateway test wouldn't then be scored against other attributes, because that would be considered a factor that would result in the site not being suitable on its own. But at this stage, because we're still consulting on the methodology, we have run all the sites through the scoring process as well. So it's that's the distinction of a gateway test, but it's not. We've also scored all the sites as well at this stage because we're still consulting on the methodology. We've also indicated whether the site's in the green belt or not as well. Again, that's not. I've said that at this stage it's not a gateway test, but it obviously is an important consideration. So to give consultees an understanding of the designation of the site, whether it's in green belt or not, we've added that information into the we've added that information into the material and scores that are given. The second stage of the site assessment is looking at scoring the site, giving it an overall score against a series of indicators, and there's around, I think, 25 indicators that it's scored against at the moment in terms of attributes of the site. Is it positive or is it negative against kind of a neutral position? So it's things like, it takes into account access to services, access to public transport. It also takes into account a whole range of environmental designations, woodland, biodiversity, nature conservation sites, flood risk. There's a whole range of different considerations that are air quality, whether the land's greenfield or brownfield, contaminated land. That's actually, has it got potential to clear up existing contamination through development? Does it impact green space? Is it within a town centre or not? Just running through them. Agricultural land and whether it's best and most versatile agricultural land. Whether it impacts any existing minerals resources. Whether it affects non-road transport networks, so potential for rail freight, water freight. Any impact on community facilities. Impact on landscape character. So we haven't done a landscape assessment of each site, but is it in an area of special landscape or not? And then we've also got some other considerations around, does it impact waste processing facilities and things like that. So they're all scored from -3 to +3, so -3 being a negative impact and +3 being a positive. They're not all scored over that whole range because some factors are more important than others. So where it's clearly very important positive impact, it scores +3. To a very important negative impact, it scores -3. So you've got that broad range for some, but for others, like is it in a town centre or not, it can only sort of score +1 or neutral. So it's less of a factor than things like flood risk or biodiversity impact or that. So there is some weighting there to give you the overall score. So adding up all those scores for all those tests, you get an overall score for the site. For most sites at the moment, most sites we've had submitted to us are outside urban areas. They tend to score negatively, picking up negative scores in relation to various environmental constraints. We've not considered any mitigation at this stage. It just tells us the score of the site before you've considered any mitigation. Obviously, other sites do score positively, particularly in urban areas, and they're the sites we've kind of assessed as having the most potential at this stage. And then the there's a sort of gradual kind of score from just negative to very negative, which I think it goes up to -20 is the worst site. You've obviously got some sites that are only just negative, and there's obviously more potential to mitigate those negative impacts that are identified through the assessment. In terms of showing them on maps, we've shown a broad score, so the sites scoring 0 or above we've indicated as green. Those scoring between -1 and -9 we've indicated as yellow. We've also, in that category, we've also put sites that are positive scoring but within green belt, because obviously there's that designation issue to address as well. The more poorly scoring sites we've got as orange, so -10 to -20. Sometimes we call it amber, sometimes we call it orange, but yeah, we'll clarify that's the same thing, and we'll change that scoring indicator to mean they're the lower performing sites. And then we've indicated red where the site's failing a gateway test. So if some of its areas within functional floodplain, triple SIs or H&M woodland at this stage, they're shown as red. Obviously, with all those things, there's potential to avoid that overlap if you change the site boundary. So we've said in the material that there's an option for developers to say, okay, the boundary can change. It'll then have a different score if it avoids some of these negative impacts. So that's one way of avoiding it. And I think, well, obviously I'll open it to questions now, but I think that broadly covers the approach we've taken. It's just, again, to sort of emphasise, it is very objective at this stage, and it's not. There's no judgment over other than the overall scoring system and how we put together. There's no other judgments made in changing the scores of those sites from that derives from the boundary and then the overlaps with all these designations.
Thanks, Paul. Everybody happy with that?
Can I just ask one question? I think Barry might want to come in as well. If we just talk about the red sites, when we go out to the consultation process, are they going to be in the system, or are we going to simply, or are they going to be in the system for a discussion, or are we simply going to leave them out? And if they are in the system, are we effectively going to say, yes, site X was put forward, but we've discounted it because?
At this stage, they'll be kept in because we're consulting on the methodology. So what we're saying is they're failing against the methodology as it stands. But I think to just be open about it, we're showing the scoring of the site as well. But the next stage, if all those attributes remain the same, then it wouldn't be, it would fail that gateway test, so it wouldn't be carried forward. So at this stage, we're saying it would fail under our current approach that we're consulting on and with the current attributes of the site.
Councillor Anderson.
Yeah, on indicator 8A, accessibility to public transport, what do you define as high frequency?
Sorry, we've done it broadly. The data we had was amount of stops per week, so which is a bit odd. So what we did, we try and worked it out around a frequent service being a 15-minute service.
With the greatest of respect on that, there aren't many services in the city that now operate on that frequency. In my area, we're now down to a 40-minute service, which is not even getting close, even with mitigation. So, because that's the sort of question I'm going to be asked, right? Because some of the sites you've scored because they're close by to bus stops, So, I'm not convinced about that explanation being going to hold water, to be quite frank, and it doesn't seem to be set out anywhere. Because the first thing I would have thought most residents will do is go to the sites closest to them. They will then refer it back to this and say they've got it wrong, and then we'll be in a wonderful battle between us and you again as to how you've assessed something, as opposed to how the public perceive. Well, I'm talking about bus services here. If you were to speak to First Bus, for example, they would say that the services in my area are adequate. Speak to the residents, and they would give you a totally different view. That's the point. You've got it depends whose perspective you take.
My understanding of this, Councillor Anderson, is that it isn't set in stone, and it will be out for consultation. So elements like that, we can't expect the officers to know every inch of the city in detail. It will rely on input from residents and ourselves with that local knowledge.
I have a difference of opinion on that, because all you need to do is look at the individual buses and the bus frequency. That's a good start. Service number 1 is a 10-15 minute service, and the one I'm complaining about, the X84, is a 40-minute service. So anything that's on the X84 lane has got to be negative based on your criteria, and heavily negative just now. Now, I accept that potentially from 2026-27 onwards, when franchising comes in, that might change, but it's going to be difficult for me to try and justify to my residents, well, you might get a better bus service in 2 years' time, and don't worry about it. I know what will happen at the ballot box.
I think that the site you're describing should score negatively, because it isn't a high frequent. Is that correct? Have you got?
Negatively, they're almost, quite frankly, some are almost inaccessible to public transport. We had one the last time, which was something like, it was about 600 or 700 metres from the nearest bus stop, and yet, according to your colleagues in Development Plans panel, this was an accessible and sustainable location. Even your own evidence said it wasn't, but by the time it came through, so residents have no confidence in the impartiality of this that will allow certain things through. Because some parts of the city have no bus services of any description. Never mind 40 minutes, they just don't have any at all. So to me, those should be out from the beginning, because otherwise you'll end up what you've done now, if you've got a car dependency because the public transport system isn't up to scratch.
Yeah, I'd accept this approach has some limitations, because it doesn't take account of the fact that one negative aspect of a site can rule it out. So I think that's where this paints a picture of a site, but it doesn't tell you all the details, and that's when I think at the next stage there's a judgment needed to be made whether particular negative aspects are important enough to rule a site out.
Councillor Carlisle.
Thank you. Firstly, that was a really useful explanation of those gateway tests and then where we come to. So, am I correct in my understanding then? Let's say there is a site that scores green, yellow, orange, whatever it is. If it fails a gateway test and through consultation that gateway test is seen to be a sound methodology, then that will be removed and will be no longer looked at, and the actual scoring of the site doesn't matter. That's question one. I guess then, coming on to Barry's questions around bus stops, there's a very difficult way you can manage these. So if I think of one site in my ward, it would be within 500 metres easily of a 20-minute service, but then within 500 metres the other direction of another half an hourly service. Would all of those be added together? So if I'm stood in one particular point of the site, I could get a bus within 15 minutes at any time. It would just depend which direction I walked at that time. I guess in a similar, you could have 4 hourly buses all going different places. Am I right in that your methodology of 350 departures per week would build all that in? So rather than a 15-minute service, you could have 4 hourly services at walking distance, and that would score the same. Is that correct?
It would, yeah. It would. It'd be any bus stops that were in walking distance would pick up, and the number of departures from those bus stops would be picked up. And in terms of your first question, the way you described it was correct. We'd apply the gateway test first, and if it failed that, it wouldn't then be scored.
Martin.
Thank you. I think, I mean, these are really useful points that members are making, but I think at this stage in the plan making process, it's really important to set a consistency of approach for each and every site across the district. So this is a methodology that's going to apply equally, and we're looking for people to come back to us, residents with information about how they feel about the accessibility of this site, but developers to come back to us with points about, well, how we can make it better. But I think we've got to start with the evidence that's in front of us, that we've got from our transport colleagues. That's necessarily reasonably broad brush because it covers the whole of the district. We can't at this stage, knowing that we're going to discount an awful lot of these sites, spend time and resource on doing a detailed investigation on their merits now. That will come at the next stage, and we'll be able to respond to some of the points that are being made to us.
Go on.
Really brief one then over the terminology. At WICA, we would call that, so if you had 2 half-an-hour services that ended up being opposite sides of the clock face, you would end up calling that a combined frequency. And I wonder whether that's something we need to look at in the report, because absolutely, taking how Barry has read it, he doesn't have a 15-minute service in any of those areas. However, you could have the ability to walk to one service that goes to Harrogate, one service that goes... That's probably not possible in many sites, but a site I can think of would have that ability to have a 15-minute service, depending on which direction you walked and where you wanted to go to. But there's a nuance then in the wording, isn't there? Many of them will not have a high-frequency service in the way that's been interpreted by Barry. However, they would have ability to access buses reasonably frequently. So I wonder whether that's just something we need clarity in what goes up to consultation.
Yes, you could say that New Road Side, Main Road into the city centre has a combined maybe 10 to 15 minutes, but individual services are 20 to 30 minutes, so yeah, it can make a big difference. Councillor Ray.
And I think it's just a general point. I understand the use of the bus metro, and obviously have some clarity that will be looked at. I think when we do get to that detailed stage, it's not just the frequency of the bus, it's actually how accessible that stop is. And we've had this conversation before about actually how we define accessible, because accessible to me is someone who is relatively healthy, is very different to someone who's got mobility problems, and actually the very people that are going to rely on those services are the people who've probably got mobility problems and maybe don't own a car, and actually it's not just about the frequency or the combined frequency, it's about actually can you get there. And we've talked about this again and again in Development Plans panel about actually how we classify an accessible bus stop or an accessible piece of transit infrastructure, and we don't seem to have actually moved to a position where we're actually taking account of the needs and the disabilities of our residents. You know, we're talking a lot about EDI at the moment, and actually part of that is actually understanding people's needs, and actually has that actual metric being considered in terms of accessibility to these, not just frequency.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And some of our conversations with our transport colleagues have been around, well, what can we secure from developers to actually improve the wider environment, to actually improve that active travel and that accessibility. So looking at any potential development site at the next stage and justifying site contributions to actually improve that. So and that goes all the way back to the consultation responses that we get, the difficulty in being able to access a bus stop. We need to hear about that. That then provides us with evidence should that be a priority for the site, for developers to actually pay for improvements.
Councillor Lamb.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think the reason we're focusing in on public transport is because most of the other indicators need a level of expertise, and this we just need to know our areas, and I would say without exception around the table we do know that. And what it shows us is whether we should have confidence in the areas where we don't have a level of expertise. And in the public transport indicator, that's where it's giving an issue. So if I pick on two settlements in my ward, of Thorpe Arch and Bramham, there's a real inconsistency in the approach that then makes me wonder, well, are we consistent everywhere else? So in both cases, so if you take Thorpe Arch trading estate, there's a number of proposals. There is 2 buses a day, Monday to Friday, and we've scored that as -3, which seems reasonable. If we take Bramham in my ward, which has an hourly service when it turns up, that's scored as a -3, which seems reasonable. When it comes to the rail accessibility, they both score -2. We don't have a train station. So there is a bus service of sorts, and -3 seems reasonable. We do not have access to a train. So how do we get to -2 for rail? And then when you see inconsistencies like that, where I don't need a level of expertise, I start to wonder about the things where I would need a level of expertise. And if we and the public don't have confidence in the numbers when we take this out to consultation, the whole thing starts to unravel very, very quickly.
I think.
Okay. People can't hear you if you're not using your microphones. We don't want a conversation like this. Right. I've got Councillors Campbell and Finnegan, but Paul wants to come in on this one.
I think the reason is I said we'd used a weighting, so not every indicator went to -3. So for rail, it was -2. Because of the distribution of rail stations, it was not possible for everywhere to live within a distance of a rail station. But happy to pick up on that through the consultation. If people think that indicators should all be weighted to -3, then we can look at that. That's the reasoning that it received the lowest score, but the lowest score was limited to -2 in that case for rail as compared to buses.
So my other point was, is this a desktop exercise? My assumption is it is, and I just wonder if there's a bit of filtering to do of local member knowledge on their bits before this goes out further.
I mean, can I just say, so it's page 612, Councillor Lamb, will give you the explanation of the indicator, accessibility to public transport brackets rail, and that sets out how it's been scored and what the -2 means, and you'll see that there isn't a -3. So there wouldn't have been a -3. So I think you can have confidence in the way that that's been assessed. Secondly, I think the public consultation will be the route to receiving these comments.
Councillor Campbell.
I think we're picking up, as Alan says, we're picking up on the public transport issue, because that's what we're going to get quite a lot of grief about from members of the public. And I think we need some sort of confidence that the process allows us to, in effect, I suppose, exclude sites that don't have any access to public transport, the public transport network. And I think that there are 2 points. One, as we've been talking, it struck me that maybe we ought to think about linking the rail and the bus services together, because it's a public transport issue. And it seems to me that if it's 3.5 kilometres from a railway station, you're going to drive to the railway station. It doesn't. So it just seems to me that perhaps in other cities they regard it as an integrated system, and perhaps we ought to think about that. The second point, I suppose, relates to will it be possible to argue, for example, I'll use Poole as my example. So Poole, you could say, has quite a good bus service in some ways. They wouldn't agree with you, but it's got quite a good bus service. If you want to go to Harrogate, if you want to go to the airport, or if you want to go to Bradford. If you want to go to Leeds, it's quite complicated. And I think that's part of the issue as well, is yes, there may well be a half-hourly service, and I think that it's more than half hours actually in Poole, but actually you can't get into Leeds. And so I do think we need to perhaps refine some elements of this to allow the public to respond, because they will respond about this. This is something we're going to get a lot of grief about, in the way that we're not, well, we're going to get comments about everything, but I think there's going to be fine detail on this, because actually this is something that people experience every day.
Councillor Finnegan.
Thanks, Chair. One of your assessments is down to, how do you put it, proximity to services at this particular point. Now, my community that took a real battering under the last one at this point, in fact we've got no protected areas of search left, they're all being developed. But leaving that aside, the argument the community always puts is, well, that school's not accessible if it's full. That health centre's not accessible if we can't sign on at that particular point. How do you make sure that the model is sophisticated enough to basically say that school's full, so it isn't accessible, we'll go down to the further one, other than, as Councillor Lamb suggested, you have a word with local ward councillors, because it's almost like fantasy planning, isn't it? Yeah, there's a school there, that's fine, that makes it accessible. There's a health centre there, there's a dentist there, that's fine, that makes it accessible. Well, none of that in reality is the case, is it? So how do you make sure that your model deals with that? And the only other comment that I would make is, to a degree, all of this assessment is going to be fairly academic if the government basically sets a target and you're rifling through your greens, your yellows and into your oranges to actually hit that target. So the community will be sceptical that you, me, any of us have much of an influence on this particular one, and will be looking at everything up to and including, I reckon, the orange sites that are in their areas and saying that's what's going. Because realistically, if you've got a housing target that is set by central government, then to hit that housing target, like last time, we had to hit a housing target that was unrealistic and unachievable, and we ended up losing all our past sites. How do we make sure that this isn't just an academic exercise? This is a genuine exercise, communities being able to influence where development goes, because if you're onto the orange sites, as I suspect you will be, it's all fairly academic, is this, isn't it?
Do you want to answer that one, Paul?
I can start, and then Paul can come back in. I think that's a fair point, and I'll repeat that at this stage, this is a consistent assessment of the sites that are in front of us. These sites, of which there are over 600, we won't need anywhere near that many. So we don't want to spend the resource and the time that it would take to do a detailed assessment of sites that are not going to come forward. And we're not taking a view at this stage until we've heard from local people and developers as to what sites should and could come forward. So what you're saying is important, but that will happen at the next stage, where we will consult on what the preferred council sites are, where we've been able to plug in the availability of infrastructure information, because at the moment we don't have that for this consultation. We're not saying how full the doctor's surgeries are. There will be a separate infrastructure delivery plan that seeks to set that up. But it will also look at the council's choices as to how it wishes to prioritise and what objectives it wishes to prioritise, whether it wishes to prioritise delivery of affordable housing where it's needed, or accessibility to bus or accessibility to infrastructure, we might not be able to meet everything on every single site. So there might need to be some choices to be made by the council, but this panel will be involved in making those choices, where we present to it the results of this consultation, which is going to build on the assessment starting point that we've put out. Does that make sense?
Very brief, that's fine, and I understand that. But if the government basically says you'll hit this target, then at that point, all of it's fairly academic, isn't it? It's purely a discussion of worse and worser. That's a phrase.
So it's probably helpful for members to sort of hold in their mind as well the actual numbers that we're dealing with through this consultation. And if you turn to objective 1 in your material, which is in the report, which is page it's about page 28. Sorry, 20. My PDF seems to have it different, so apologies. So in para 41F, that sets out the scale of the task, and it is not as large a task as it was last time in the core strategy and the site allocations plan. As Paul's suggested, there are already just over 40,000 homes with planning permission and existing allocations. There is a windfall allowance which we can incorporate in the plan. So what we're actually looking for from newly allocated sites, which are going to be subject to this assessment process, is around 18,000 homes across the district. Now, we're not going to be able to meet all of that on the green sites, but we should be able to meet all of that by looking at the yellow sites, subject to how members and the council wish the spatial strategy to be arranged, and whether the gains for delivering more housing locally to meet local needs are seen to outweigh maybe some of the sustainability disbenefits. But those choices will be made at the next stage of consultation.
Councillor Ray first.
This is probably a really stupid question. We keep talking about distances, and it's a real bugbear of mine. Are we talking as the crow flies, or as actually people walk and drive? Because they're two completely different things. Something 3 kilometres as the crow flies is very different when actually it might be 6 or 7 kilometres they have to walk it or drive it. And actually, if we're talking about accessibility, just putting a radii on something, actually, I mean, we had this when we were looking at school transport, and actually the movement went, well, actually, you look at actually the actual distance travelled, not what the crow flies. I know that's a really niche point, but it is vastly different in reality, because actually, as the crow flies, you might have to go through 2 people's fields. So it's not. So I know that sounds like a really nitpicky point, but it's actually quite a significant issue for people.
Yeah, I understand that point, and for bus stops it is walking distance. For rail station, we hadn't got that data when we did it, so that's crow flies, but we can look at that again for next time. I understand that's a really important point.
But can I just go back? But that's for all access to services. It's not just for transport, but also some of the other services where I think Councillor Vinnigan's raised about, well, actually, you may have a GP there in a certain distance, but actually that distance may be quite considerable. So it's when you actually walk there or drive there. Sorry, but yeah, I think it needs to be as actual people actually travel, not on the radii.
So for everything other than access to rail stations, it is as people are actually walking, because it draws on the extensive work that was done for the complete, compact and connected 15-minute neighbourhood work. Yeah.
Councillor Blackburn.
Just a quickie. and it struck me when you were asking questions about to do with target number of houses. How are these figures written in stone, or can central government come along and say, "Oh, we're wrong, we want them changing"?
So they will change,
Yeah.
but central government, well, I suspect they won't say we're wrong. What they will do is every year they will look at the calculation, which includes an affordability assessment. And that affordability assessment, we already know, has changed between 2024 and 2025. So actually, the material that we presented to this panel in the last year was 40 homes a year fewer than the material that we're presenting now. So it's increased by 40 homes. That's why it's important for us to have a buffer in order to deliver the government's housing number. So we've set a 10% buffer in terms of the land to be identified to meet the overall housing target, just to kind of deal with that potential risk.
So that could be that figure, 18,000 figure, could be 21, 22,000 or below.
The 18,000 figure is reasonably set at the moment because I don't think we expect the government's number to change sort of within the sort of the time frame that we're seeking to take this to submission to the planning inspectorate. It would be what would change is potentially any sites that come out of the wider sort of stock of housing that we've got. So any change that might happen to an allocated site or a site with planning permission, if a developer decided that they wanted to bring that forward for an alternative use, for example, that might knock it out.
Councillor Anderson.
Just taking at face value, your assurance that more probable than not that red sites will not go forward, right? Why are we still consulting on them? Because I can assure you in my area, those are the ones that probably my residents will be on my tail over. And I won't be able to tell them explicitly, don't get too aerated about that, because it's unlikely to go ahead, because that's going to defeat the whole purpose of the consultation. So if we didn't consult on them in the first place, because I got an excellent briefing off of Ian Mackay the other day, and what we were talking about is the need to find, well, what I'll call the least objectionable sites, the ones that aren't perfect by any manner of means, but have got more people supporting it than not supporting it, and getting people to respond positively to your consultation. You're going to have people spending a lot of time hammering you on this site shouldn't be included at all, and privately you actually agree with them. But they're going to send you in pages and pages of statistics. You know, for some of the ones in my area, which I've already said about the transport, you'll get people, all those people who know every single bus that exists in the city, they'll be able to tell you all about it. Now, that's not going to help your consultation, because you're going to have to go through all of those responses. So if we didn't consult them in the first place, it would cut down the number of sites that were coming forward. It would give, and then when you come to the yellow ones, you know, some of those yellow ones probably won't come forward either, but because the way you're wording yellow, it means everybody thinks if it's in the yellow, there is a possibility of that coming forward. And again, taking your reassurance, some of those will not even officers are suggesting them at the moment. So how do we get round that? Because those of us who have got constituents will be on our back from the moment this goes in the public domain. We've got a number of neighbourhood plan areas who will be on to us. I mean, how are we going to deal with that?
So we can't hide what we don't like. We have to be open about the process that we've gone through. And these sites have been submitted to us by developers as part of a call for sites. So we are legally bound to assess them and provide an indication of how they score. I think what I would suggest to you, Councillor Anderson, is that a local person who is concerned about a red site coming forward should write in support of the council's assessment. And and support that doesn't come through to the next stage, because it wouldn't with the red assessment. But similarly, in looking at the green, the yellow and the amber, it's very useful for us to hear from local people as to the reasons why, dealing with the assessment approach that the council's taken, they believe either that assessment is right or that assessment is wrong, or that assessment doesn't include something that's important to them locally about a site coming forward. But I also think it would be really helpful if, having set out that one of the objectives of this plan is to meet some local needs locally for a range of different developments and a range of different types of development. We know some people would really value some bungalows being built in their area, some older persons housing, for example. Which sites would they like to see come forward would be really helpful, and the reasons why. Because I think if everyone objects to everything, then we're going to have to take a view that doesn't necessarily take into account the strength of local feeling. So it would be really helpful to understand if there was local support for particular sites coming forward.
Anybody else? No. Right. Paul, have you got anything further you wish to say on this?
No, I've obviously taken on board the comments that have been made, and we can look at through those and consultation how we need to change the methodology to reflect the various issues we've heard.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Right, have you got anything else, Martin?
Yeah, so I mean, there's kind of two other key elements, really. I mean, I think this panel has had quite a lot of opportunity to comment on some of the detailed sort of objectives, the direction of travel that the council's taking on those objectives, which in due course will set policy. But I'm happy to take any questions on the objectives now. But also, in terms of the consultation material, just to clarify that Appendix 1 will be in an online format, broken down into the commonplace sort of tabs which members have seen previously and been briefed on. Whether members have got anything else to add in terms of the consultation and the approach to the material.
Councillor Anderson.
One thing that would help is the way that you put out the site assessments. It's a mixture of an outer northwest. You've got maybe one in Yeadon, and then next to it's one in Bramhope, and then the next one is in Horsforth. If you had a way of consolidating them together so that people can see what the impact on their community is, so that they can then give a positive affirmation that they feel this site will be far better than other ones, and then you could see what's happening at a glance, because at the moment you've got to search through. So that's number one. Number two, why have we not included infrastructure needs on those sites? Because again, that's going to be another point that residents are going to raise. They're going to say, well, we've got infrastructure needs here. That doesn't appear at face value to have been taken into consideration, because it might be that by investing, let's say, £1 million in an area, you can bring that site up to bordering on a zero, right? Whereas other sites you might need to spend 10, 12 million pounds in the hope that it comes up. So you need to look at what's going to happen. Why has that not been taken into consideration? And then the final thing is a pedantic point. Page 494, you've got one site which is definitely in outer northwest. You've put it in outer northwest, but you've called it Bramley. It's actually Bramhope. It should be. It's actually.
Bit of a difference.
It should actually. It should actually be. It should actually be Bramhope.
Oh yeah.
You know,
Look on that? Yeah. So thanks for that, Councillor Anderson. Yeah. We can look at how we arrange the site assessments. I mean, what consultees won't see it as a bundle of paper. What they'll be able to do is navigate by their area. So they'll be able to search by their house postcode, by their village, their town, and they'll be able then to see the sites around that. So it because it's mainly being driven by the sort of the commonplace model, which enables people to access it by a computer or by a laptop or by a phone, they'll be able to much more easily navigate to how they want to see the information. But we can have a look for the PDF version, which is not driving this consultation. We can have a look at how we arrange that. Just in terms of infrastructure needs, I sort of made the point earlier, but I'll make it again because I think it's important that we've set out an approach to how we're going to look at infrastructure. We've set out the fact that infrastructure isn't delivered to a large extent by the City Council, and we're reliant on other infrastructure providers to do that. But we've also set out that we'll commit to an infrastructure delivery plan, which will be prepared at the same time as we look at our preferred options. So it's at that preferred option stage that we start to look at the infrastructure, because it's a complicated and resource-intensive process, and to do that for 600 sites, of which we're not going to need them all, is a waste of resource. What we want to do is we want to look at the specific infrastructure implications of the chosen sites and then consult on that, and that will happen at the next round of consultation. So there will be an opportunity for people to come back to us on what we've said about access to local doctors, local dentists, and local schools, etc.
Enough, please, Councillor Anderson. Councillor Finnegan.
In terms of the consultation, so when you've got this online map, so I'm whizzing along on it, if I'm inclined to do so, it'll be that's red, that's yellow, that's orange, whatever at that particular point. How are you going to articulate that for people who aren't going to be accessible? Certainly older folk and other such things that aren't digitally enhanced. And how are you going to localise the consultation so that it isn't fully online, that, I don't know, you're out in all of our communities at least once, so that people can raise their concerns at that particular point?
Is this one for you, Ian?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Finnegan. We'll be doing a series of drop-in events across the district, and the idea there is that they will be local in nature. So, but experience from last time round is that people will come from surrounding neighbourhoods to perhaps, say, Morley Town Hall, for example. One of the things that we definitely do need to improve on is that last time round we didn't have too many paper copies from consultees. I think that paints a particular picture. This time round it's very important to pick up on the point that you've just made, that not everyone is comfortable using some of the digital technology, etc. And I think part of that will be making sure that the drop-in events are properly staffed, and there is choice for everybody. So some people might want to come along and just learn about the consultation. Others might want to actually sit down, perhaps even have a debate, fill out a consultation form there and then. I think one of the big things about this consultation is to remind ourselves about what it is that we actually want to get out of it. So, yes, we want endorsement of the general approach that's been taken, but we do also want challenge as well. We want new evidence, and also, importantly, we want new ideas. So the success of that consultation won't just be in terms of numbers, it will be in terms of a mix of all those different elements. So in terms of Morley, I think previous consultations, there was a high level of interest in that, and we would expect to do a similar approach this time around. But I'm more than happy to have a separate chat with you about that.
Martin, do you come in? Any more queries? Oh, Councillor Campbell.
You made a reference to other infrastructure providers. Have you had much consultation with them in relation to their ability or willingness to effectively provide the infrastructure? I know that the issues. I remember last time when we talked about education, fairly early on in the system, we got the council's then education department in to say what they felt was needed. I think really we're all going to get you can't get a doctor's appointment, you can't get a dentist's appointment. And so I think that's an element that we need to ensure that if we provide these houses, there is some commitment from those infrastructure providers to actually service them.
So it's very much horses for courses, in that it depends on which bit of infrastructure you're talking about and who's responsible for delivering it. So what City Council's done over the last sort of few years is started to build relationships with different infrastructure providers, particularly those that in the past we didn't have a particularly good relationship with. So our relationship with public health now is significantly better than it was when we were doing the site allocations plan, for example. And members, you may have attended a public health briefing training session, which was held with sort of members of my service and development management colleagues about 2 months ago, where that sort of set out the approach to looking at how public health deal with increased demand on their services. And it isn't an approach whereby government will fund public health providers in anticipation of new homes coming forward. It's very much new homes come forward and then public health providers make the bids to central government for more resource. That's the system. And that's what we've explained within some of the background material to this. For something like energy provision and energy infrastructure providers, we're working closely with the Combined Authority and their local energy action plan to ensure that those responsible for delivering northern power networks, for example, have within their long-term investment plans the capacity and the capability to be able to meet X amount of additional housing coming forward. The same with national highways in terms of impact and implications on the national road network, which we don't manage, and also in terms of Yorkshire Water and the water companies, in terms of their long-term development plans and the ability for them to be able to provide not only water to houses but also to deal with sewage and waste from them. So there's a lot of conversations that will happen. We will use the consultation to reinforce some of those conversations, because at that consultation there will be a preferred direction of travel in terms of an overall housing number, an overall employment number, and a kind of a broad spatial strategy in terms of where that will focus. So the questions for some infrastructure providers will be, if Leeds grows by 70,000 homes over the next 18 years, and it's mainly within an expanded city centre, are you able to deal with the water, the energy, etc. that arises from that, but also specifically conversations with public health around, so where are the current GP surgeries and dentists, and what's the critical mass that we'd be looking for in terms of number of new homes and occupants to be able to actually then create new accommodation and new premises. And then we will see some of that coming through in terms of site requirements on sites that are to be brought forward, as well as in appropriate locations, allocations for infrastructure, but then maybe for the majority for the rest of the district, we'll be looking at, well, what's the capacity to absorb additional pressure on services, and what do public health, what do schools say about that, and their ability then and their confidence in seeking further investment down the line once that housing is in place. So it's a complicated approach, which is why we do it when we've got a preferred suite of sites rather than when we don't know whether these sites are going to come forward or not.
I appreciate that, and there's always been this issue, hasn't there, particularly in relation to health provision, about it, effectively it's retrospective. And I suppose I can understand it's quite simple in the case of, say, Yorkshire Water or the power grid or whatever they call these days. You know, you can put a condition on the development, which is thou shalt not occupy more than 10% of the houses until a new substation is put in. But it's slightly different with the health provision. I'm just wondering if, given the government's pronouncements about major housing developments, is there any reference in that there's talking about the assumption that provision for things like health requirements will be encouraged, I think is the word.
So there is, and as part of the sort of the government's sort of manifesto pledges around planning, and as we're seeing come through the changes in the planning and infrastructure bill, so it's called a planning and infrastructure bill, for example, that there is an attempt to sort of link those, but we understand that the city council doesn't hold the purse strings. The city council, in many cases, alongside the infrastructure providers, are bidding back to government in terms of providing that infrastructure through comprehensive spending reviews in the future.
Sorry to belabour this perhaps, but it's just struck me. I remember with the last plan we put a considerable number of houses to the east of Leeds. Is there a possibility or any mileage in us saying we can provide these houses, but there is a requirement for a new doctor's surgery? In the same way that we said in that case, there's a necessity to provide a new one-form entry school or a two-form entry school.
So for all of the allocations, when we look to move between this stage and preferred site allocations stage, will be scrutinised in terms of their infrastructure needs and their infrastructure demands and how they fit within the sort of the local community. At that stage, we'll then need to look at whether there is a requirement for additional premises to be provided and how they are provided. You're generally not going to get a new school on a small site. So a site of 50, 100, 200 houses isn't going to provide a new school or a new doctor's surgery. But what we would need to look at is the cumulative impact on that and how to best secure that premises, should our evidence tell us that it's needed.
That's why I used East Leeds as the example, because there were a lot of houses, like about 9,000, didn't there, went in there. And it's patently obvious that if you put in that number of housing in, you need extra infrastructure in relation not just to roads but for all the other services. And I appreciate that a 20 house site's not going to generate a doctor's surgery, but okay, if we're happy that a cumulative effect applies, then
and just to finish the point, Councillor Campbell, that will be something that will be a choice for the council to take in terms of which sites it seeks to allocate, because it may seek to allocate larger sites if those larger sites bring with them infrastructure that remedies not only sort of current issues but also issues brought around by the development itself.
Councillor Anderson.
I'm lucky or unlucky, depending on the way you look at it, that I was at a briefing at the Combined Authority the other day, and they were talking about this mass transit spatial development framework and how we're all out of kilter with each other. The 5 authorities and WIC are out of kilter with each other. How are we going to incorporate that in? Because some of us would argue that you should look at the corridors they're going and then making sure that there is housing built within reasonable distances, whether it's 5 minutes, 10 minutes or 15 minutes of walking distance to those things. How are we going to incorporate that in? Because we could end up consulting on something, people thinking one thing's going to happen, but when this comes to fruition, we may have to just pivot a bit and reprioritise and take some areas out that we're going to be in and put some areas in that were maybe red just now, but with this coming along, it might turn some of them to yellow in terms of transport access.
So it's a good question. So at the same time as this local plan, development plan document, there's an intent to produce a joint development plan document, which I think you were briefed on at the WICA meeting. And that will set out, it's not that each of the 5 West Yorkshire authorities are out of kilter. It's that they don't have a policy on mass transit. So the spatial development framework, the joint development plan document, will seek to get a consistent policy on mass transit for each local planning authority within West Yorkshire. That will then help support the business case and the Transport and Works Act order, where the Secretary of State appointed planning inspector will deem planning permission for a mass transit scheme through a separate process. Okay, so it's not absolutely determinative, but it's really helpful if there's a planning policy in place. Now, this plan will be sort of being developed at the same time as that joint development plan document, and it's hoped that that joint document will be adopted before this plan. But this plan preempts what that joint SDF is going to say and do, because we've been involved, very closely involved, in not only the tender for the WICA work, but also the assessment of that work, and we will continue to be closely involved in the development of that development plan document through a joint committee and an officer working group. So there will be complete alignment between the 2 DPDs as they move forward. The way we've preempted that joint DPD is by, in our spatial strategy options, looking at the importance of the Leeds-Bradford and the Leeds-Dewsbury corridors in terms of suitable location for housing growth. But what we've said is that we can't use mass transit as a reason, as the only reason, to sort of release significant parcels of land from the green belt at the moment until we know, all of the things being equal. We can't assume that mass transit's going to run through a site. So at this stage, what we're doing is we're framing that. And don't forget, this is an 18-year plan period. So, and we're obliged every 5 years to review it to see if it needs to be updated anyway by government guidance and legislation. So as we know whether mass transit is coming or not, we can carry out a review of the plan to see if it needs to be updated. And at that point, then knowing that there's 5 years added to the plan period at the end of the plan, we can start to look at, well, what areas might support delivery of housing beyond the plan period. And if we've got a mass transit system in place, we'll need to look at that.
Any other comments? Questions? No? Anything from you, Martin?
No, it's just to say thank you. Yeah, sorry. So I'm happy to, if members haven't got any more questions, I'm happy to sort of conclude the meeting and just remind members of the recommendations, which are to to recommend to Executive Board that they approve the material, and that's been set out this afternoon. And the other thing is that, conscious that we are still working on sort of the non-material changes to the consultation documents, so some of the language can change, but any material amendments that we make will certainly be made and brought to the attention of Executive Board, and we'll keep closely in contact with Councillor Pryor as Executive Member and the Chief Planning Officer in terms of any changes that are made to this material. So the Exec Board date is the 18th of June.
Right, everybody happy to recommend this goes to Exec Board? Quick show of hands, please. Okay. Any objection? Any no? Thank you, Mr. Councillor Finnegan. Any abstentions? Nope. Okay, so I've got that recommendation to take it forward. So thank you very much, everybody, for that, and thank you for making it a fairly quick meeting. The date and time of the next meeting is still under consideration and not yet confirmed. Further information will be provided in due course and will be agreed at the annual council meeting. The next meeting will have a different chair, as I'm moving away from this role, and that will be Councillor Maloney, who's sat patiently listening to it all today, this afternoon. So I'll leave you in her good hands for the next meeting. Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody.